Hello and welcome to this week's episode. I have a very special treat today as I welcome my first guest, Michelle. Hello, Michelle, and thank you so much for joining me. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So I am Michelle. I am originally from the United States. I grew up in Wisconsin and married my Irish husband and have been living in Ireland now. We're based in Limerick for the last 7 years. And when I moved to Ireland, I had already had some inkling that I was really interested in birth, really interested in pregnancy. I had 3 babies already. So during my fourth pregnancy, I trained as a birth doula in Dublin, and I would later go on to train as a postpartum doula and hypnobirthing instructor. So I have loads of bits and pieces that I do for expecting parents. And my latest endeavor is what is called Fat and Pregnant, which is both a website and an Instagram account. And I basically spend my time advocating for plus size people. I use the word fat quite regularly as a neutral term, an additive basically describing somebody's body type. So you might hear me use that today. But yeah, so basically I advocate for plus size people so they have more positive pregnancies and births because people who bigger bodies often are treated differently. Weight stigma does exist within the medical community, and unfortunately, it does discriminate against people during pregnancy as well. So I'm on a mission to improve the way people approach that pregnancy and hopefully create change and more compassionate care for everybody.
That's amazing. Thank you. Why did you feel called to help bring an awareness to the issues faced by a pregnant person who falls into the category of having a high BMI?
During my fourth pregnancy, well, I suppose most of my pregnancies actually, I didn't experience a lot of weight stigma myself. The first time I did was during my second pregnancy, and I was looking to have a home birth in Ireland, and I explored my options, and I eventually got in contact with a community midwife. She was based about an hour away from me, and I knew, so like guidelines in Ireland are different than what they are in the UK, and I was concerned. There's all these criteria, so I was concerned that my BMI might unfortunately quote unquote risk me out of the home birth service. So I contacted a midwife, and it took some courage just to even call her and to discuss this worry that I had. And I got in touch with her, and I basically just said, I'm looking to have this home birth. However, I am concerned that my weight might rule me out of the home birth service. And eventually I went online and typed in my height and weight and found out my BMI, and I told her my BMI, and she said, "Oh wow, you are big." And it was so awkward and uncomfortable, and it was like there was judgment in her voice, and I felt so humiliated. Like I got off that phone call relatively quickly, and I didn't end up having a home birth, but that was the first time I really experienced any kind of judgment about my weight during pregnancy. And I went on to, so that birth wasn't a home birth, but my third and fourth pregnancy were. And I started learning more about body positivity and body neutrality and what that means. So I suppose what I think is more important is body neutrality, which is basically viewing your body and accepting your body and appreciating what your body does. So
Absolutely.
instead of, focusing on what your body looks like to yourself and others, it's really like, especially during pregnancy, being able to appreciate all those changes and shifts and growth and development, like you're growing an entire human being. So body neutrality for me, and it's not that you have to love everything that's happening, because I mean, you and I both know pregnancy has it's a whole array of challenges, but I really first dove into what body neutrality is, And then I just fell down this rabbit hole of, what is weight stigma and how are fat people treated differently? And then, like, I basically combined my two passions. So my passion for birth and pregnancy, and then this newly sparked passion for basically fighting for compassionate care for plus size people, because no matter what your size, pregnancy can be a really joyful, amazing thing, and birth is no different no matter your size as well. So I started the Instagram account, and I had a feeling that as you do, you might get a few messages, but I was astounded at the dozens and dozens of messages I started to receive on a daily basis of people describing just this awful, awful care, disrespectful care, basically being told what they had to do. And it was all based on their size. So I just knew. I knew instantly, because I would be someone that would want to help people anyway. So hearing these really awful stories, things that I had not experienced myself, but hearing these stories, I just knew that there was work to do, and that I could support people of size, people that look like me, same shape, same size, larger than me, basically just giving them the tools that they needed to be able to navigate pregnancy in a much more positive way. Because if anybody does a Google search and you type in plus size pregnancy, most of what's going to come back are really negative depictions of plus size birth. So it'll talk about complications, it'll talk about quote unquote higher risks, it'll talk about all these really negative things that can happen. And there's very little out there that tells people, like, hold on a second, there's this whole other side to plus size pregnancy that isn't being discussed and isn't out in the open. And that's really what I'm trying to do now, is paint a different picture for people, because if you're only getting one side, one side of it,
Yeah.
it's very grim if that's all you're hearing on a day-to-day basis.
If
So
if you
that's where it came from.
Thank you. If you were the birth partner of a plus size person and they were being told the risks, what might they have heard, whether those risks are, real risks or not? What kinds of things are pregnant people being told about the risks involved in giving birth when you're plus sized?
So I would say, throughout pregnancy, what often comes up are kind of the three major things that come up are that, all plus size people are going to have gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and hypertension. And the reality is that the chances of a person with a higher BMI having any of those is increased. But what's really important is that people understand the difference between a relative and absolute risk.
Yeah.
So, for example, somebody might be told, if their BMI is 40 or higher, which is the highest tier. So it's just 40 or higher. They don't go any higher than that with the research. So someone might, with a BMI higher than 40, might be told, your chances of having gestational diabetes is 6 times higher than somebody with a lower BMI. And that can sound really scary. That sounds pretty intense to be told, wow, I am 6 times more likely. But if you actually look at the research and you break that down and you take it step by step, somebody whose BMI is under 19, which is actually considered being, like, quote unquote underweight,
Yeah.
so somebody at the lowest end of the spectrum, their chances of having gestational diabetes is 3%. Whereas if you're 40 or over in regards to BMI, then your chances of having gestational diabetes is 17%. But that's still about 6 times higher. But what that also means, so, like, okay, you have a 17% chance of having gestational diabetes if you have that BMI over 40, that also means that you have an 83% chance of not having gestational diabetes. But it's not framed that way. So, people might be told, they might be talked to about gestational diabetes, as I said, preeclampsia, or hypertension. And so those are a couple of the big things. But what
No,
else ends up in
absolutely.
my, what else ends up in my inbox quite often is people being told that they're not going to be strong enough to give birth vaginally.
Really?
Yeah. So, if we take a step back and we look at weight stigma or weight bias in general, what are people told? What are, bigger people told? That they are lazy, that they're
Yeah.
weak, that they don't have any self-control. And some of those beliefs translate into pregnancy, where now a provider who may or may not even be aware that they have a weight bias all of a sudden thinks everybody who's fat can't push out their baby. So there are people in who contact me who say, my doctor has told me I can't have a vaginal birth. That there's no point in me even trying. That I should just go straight to planned cesarean. So that's something else they might hear. They might also be told that they have to get an epidural placed early, and unfortunately, there is a higher chance of having a epidural sited more than once, so it might not be inserted correctly the first time, but that can happen to anybody.
Anyone? Yeah.
Yeah, but it is presented as like, oh, well, just to be on the safe side, we want you to get an epidural placed during early labor. But then there's no conversation about, you and I both know, the BRAIN acronym. So what are the potential benefits, potential risks, and potential alternatives?
Yeah.
So, but there's not, that conversation isn't happening. So they're not looking at, not exploring, well, what are the potential benefits of early epidural placement? So they'll just say, well, if you get it placed earlier, then there's enough time for it to take effect, where if you may need to have a cesarean, or if it has to be cited again. And that's kind of where the conversation ends. They don't go to the risks of having an epidural, and what how that may impact the rest of someone's labor. So people are presented with part of the picture, or really kind of catastrophizing languages used of, you're not going to be able to birth your baby, you're not going to be strong enough. I believe a cesarean is the best option for you, or because you're a bigger person, your baby's going to be bigger. That's something else as well. Whether somebody has gestational diabetes or not, and it it can it can really throw people to be told, these things that sound like facts.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the reasons why it's so lovely to talk to you, to be able to, get this information out there to anybody who's supporting a pregnant woman or birthing person to have a positive experience. Because, if they fall into this category, if they've ticked a box, if they've been at the other end of this kind of judgment, then they may just automatically think, well, I have no options, I have no choices, this is all that I have to do, because this is, I'm that person that they've just said, and therefore I've got to follow their rules. And actually no. So how would you suggest navigating pregnancy, and how, if you were a birth partner, would you navigate that pregnancy with that person, the pregnant person, to help them to stand up for themselves and say, hang on, let's look at me as an individual. Let's make sure that my preferences for my birth are, appreciated, and we can move forward in a way that supports my options and choices. Because, rather than being put in that box neatly and tidily, and having all that, well, horrible judgment placed on them. It's just so sad. I
Mm.
can't believe how, people don't even need to meet you before they've even kind of made that assumption based on a number or something else.
Yeah, and so I would say weight stigma is really pervasive. It's we're receiving messages all the time that, some of these negative messages and stereotypes again of, like, oh, if somebody's plus size, well, then clearly they don't eat very well, or they don't move very much, or they're very weak. And I would say if somebody is plus size, or if they're a birth partner supporting, supporting somebody who has a higher BMI, as you said, to just be aware that they can ask questions. And if somebody says, well, you're 3 times or 4 times or 5 more times likely to experience this, that they actually take a step back. Of course, listen to what's being said, but then take a step back and do your own research, and don't be afraid to go online and, type something in and just see what comes up, and what are the actual risks, and what's the likelihood of this really happening to me, and see how that sits with you. And I know in the UK, and in Ireland for that matter, many people are not able to choose their provider. However, I encourage anybody, anybody and everybody, to really think about who it is that is supporting them throughout pregnancy. And if you have the ability to go private or choose your provider, or, if there's people listening in America where I'm from, to look at, the different obstetricians that are covered under your insurance, and don't be afraid to talk to people, give them a call, and even just find what I call is a size friendly provider.
Yeah.
And somebody who I would say is size friendly is not going to look at a piece of paper and see your BMI and automatically make all of these assumptions without knowing anything about you. A size friendly provider provides compassionate care and sees you as a whole person. So, not a BMI or not a number on a scale. They may ask you many more questions about your health, because weight is only one small aspect of health. And I would say it's not even the most important piece, because we do have to consider, how is somebody eating? How are they moving their body? What self care do they have? How do they take care of themselves, physically and emotionally? How is their mental health, stress levels and everything else? And what type of supports do they have within their home, not only now, but for when baby is here? There's so many aspects of health that need to be considered, and a size friendly provider will, of course, go over that with you. And they don't automatically put you into this box of high risk based on your weight. And most organizations do not have a certain number where it's like, okay, well, once you're, 35 or 40, BMI, you're automatically tipped into this high risk category. There are no official guidelines in that regard, but that does not stop certain practices, even like birth centers, hospitals, birth centers, and home birth midwives. Every single provider is different. So knowing that information is really important for you. That would be the number one thing I would say to people, is if you call a birth center or midwife or doctor to automatically say, well, my BMI is this, what does that mean for me?
Mm.
What do you recommend for somebody who does have a higher BMI? And if that provider says, well, first of all, you're high risk, so I would recommend you being induced at 38 weeks because you probably will have a big baby, and then you get an epidural straight away. Like, you can see who might recommend more interventions based solely on your weight. And some people would be happy enough to go that route, and that's perfectly okay. But if somebody wants an alternative, then that should be available for them as well. And knowing that providers' views and philosophy regarding plus size birth is important. So
Yeah.
yeah, knowing that you can advocate for yourself, choose a provider if you can, but also if you cannot, knowing that you can advocate for yourself and just say, that's not for me, that's not what I want to do. What if it's the early placement of an epidural, that knowing that you can decline that procedure going forward if you want to, for sure.
One of the things that I always say to my clients is I'm quite lucky in this area that I live in. We have about 6 or 7 different hospitals and places that, you know, people can go to and choose from. I'm not sure whether you have the same luxury in Ireland, but certainly I know, as you mentioned, anyone in other countries, you know, especially the United States, may have a wide variety of different providers that they can access. And if somebody gives you a sign that they're not on board with your choice and your decisions around the type of birth you want, you can change them. And I don't think anyone in the UK, or certainly in England, understands that they can do that. So they may be sat in front of an obstetrician who says, oh, no, 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 you have to have an induction at 38 weeks or whatever. And they think, oh, that's what I have to have. Within that same trust, within that same hospital, you can walk out of that door, go up to the reception and say, that doctor's not for me. Please get me a new one who's going to respect my wishes. If that doesn't exist within that hospital, you can then change hospital and go to a different one, an NHS hospital, which has got someone who's way more supportive. Now, of course, it might mean that you have to drive 15 more minutes in another direction, but that's what matters, is that you are still the customer. You're still the person that gets to decide who speaks to you and in what way they do that. You don't have to put up with that kind of judgment, that kind of disrespect. And I wish more people knew that. I wish more people understood that they have the right to change if somebody isn't treating them appropriately and doesn't have the same philosophies as they have around their right to decide, because that's ultimately all it is, isn't it? It's about the person sat in front of them saying, well, it might not be my choice, but I completely respect it's yours, and I'm happy to help you to facilitate, you know, whatever it is. They shouldn't even say that, but you know what I mean? It's about them respecting you as a person and what you're trying to achieve. And I think with birth partners, particularly, they can often be quite embarrassed if they've got pregnant, if they're supporting a pregnant person who is trying to stand up for themselves, and they've got the opinion, well, obviously the doctor knows best. You know, in your experience with some of these red flags, you know, what would you be looking for? What would you be sort of thinking, run for the hills, this is completely false, this is terrible information, go and find yourself someone who knows what they're talking about?
I think a big red flag would be to walk into an antenatal visit and be presented with the language of, because of your size, you have to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. It's this really long list of things that are expected. And so, I mean, what many people don't understand, plus size folks may not realize, is you you often will be suggested to have further testing, and testing beyond what somebody who is straight sized or smaller than you may be recommended. So, for example, it is very common for somebody with a higher BMI to not be tested for gestational diabetes once, but twice.
Oh,
So they may be,
really?
yeah, they might be tested really early on. So, like at their first booking appointment, they may be tested straight away, basically to see if they already are pre-diabetic or diabetic.
Right.
And then they will be tested again, like many other people are, around that 28-week mark. However, if their numbers look good, if their glucose levels look fine at both of those, if their provider keeps suggesting more gestational diabetes testing, that to me would be a big red flag. And that does happen, where one provider basically says, well, because of your size, you must have gestational diabetes. And what it is it's a waste of time and resources. Because if somebody who is plus size has already gone through the test, their levels are low, there is no indication of gestational diabetes, it being suggested to them a third or even fourth time is a complete waste of time, because they've already the test results have already come back. So it's just, that would be a red flag for me. Or, you know, many people will also it will be suggested to them straight away, I want you to go see a nutritionist. Even though, the doctor may not know what their eating habits are or what their level of activity is. Again, there's this assumption of, because you're a larger person, clearly you don't know how to eat properly or eat well. When the reality is that many plus size people have been dieting for a large portion of their lives. They have been trying to lose weight. They know, most people know what they should and should not be eating. They know what is nutritious and what is not. So there's different types of assumptions that appear within maternity care. So if someone is using the language of, you have to do X, Y, or Z, that would make me take a step back and say, well, is this person willing to have a conversation with me?
Mm.
Are they willing to look, to take that step back and even consider what my lifestyle actually is like? So that would be a big indicator for me. But again, the big red flags are suggesting tests that aren't really necessary, and those blanket statements of, you are not going to be able to have this baby vaginally.
One of
And
the things, oh, sorry, go on.
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the things that always bothers me is that sometimes a person that has never had a baby before, doesn't then also know that even though they've managed to navigate things throughout pregnancy, when they get to the labor and birth, assuming that they are in a main hospital and are therefore subjected to completely different staff than they may have encountered in an antenatal clinic, because actually the midwives are very different, the doctors are very different on the day. What kinds of barriers are put in their way in labor?
There are definitely different barriers. And much like pregnancy, one of the biggest barriers is provider attitude and beliefs regarding someone who has a higher BMI. So, for example, there are studies showing the higher your BMI, the more likely you are to have a cesarean. They both peak, so if you are someone whose BMI is still, still higher, but not quite as, like, let's say there's somebody with a BMI of 40 and somebody with a BMI of 50. The person with the higher BMI is that much more likely to have a cesarean. And I really, truly believe that those two bodies have the same ability to birth. Their bodies still know exactly what to do. I don't think it's a quote unquote failure of a larger person's body in any way, shape, or form. I do believe providers have this bias, whether they know it or not. Like, for example, what we do know in terms of physicians is they're more likely to suggest continuous fetal monitoring for somebody with a higher BMI,
Yeah.
and they are more impatient with somebody with a higher BMI. So research does show that larger people living in bigger bodies, it does take a little bit longer for labor to get started, and it takes a little bit longer for active labor to get started. So when you know that, so me as a plus size person, if I know that my labor is more likely to, it's not that it doesn't progress, it's just that it might progress just a little bit more slowly. If I know that information and I have a provider who is now trying to encourage, like, is now trying to push labor along quicker, they're like, oh, you've been in labor for a while, but everything's fine with me and my baby. That's something to consider. Something to be aware of is that it's perfectly normal for my body to take a little bit longer. However, providers with a weight bias are more likely to suggest intervention sooner simply because of your weight.
Yeah.
So, knowing that and being armed with that knowledge is really powerful. And it's not to say that there's anything wrong with, saying, yeah, release my waters, or I want to start, syntocinon. There's nothing wrong with that, of course, but at least now you have a full picture. And in terms of fetal monitoring, it can be more challenging to get, I don't want to use the word accurate because I know continuous fetal monitoring, continuous fetal monitoring poses its own cons, but it's even more difficult to get a really good read on a fetal monitor if you are a plus size person. So what that also means is that people in bigger bodies are more likely to have internal fetal monitoring. It's suggested far more in plus size people. So when you know that as well, then you can say, well, it is continuous fetal monitoring something that I want. If I know they may not get a good read because, or I shouldn't say good read, but they may not get, the 20 minutes or whatever that they're looking for of that steady feed. If I consent to that, and they don't see exactly what they're hoping to see within that 20 or 30-minute period of time, is internal fetal monitoring going to be recommended? And then what does that look like? So it's just, when you know these things, you can make more informed decisions of, okay, well, maybe I don't want to do the continuous fetal monitoring then, but I'll do the intermittent, which, still is proven safe for myself and baby, but also means that the chances of internal fetal monitoring are reduced. So I would say those are the biggest things to be looking out for, is them pushing, for labor to progress more quickly, or the internal fetal monitoring. And, consider what are people's belief systems,
Yeah.
and, do they see you as being capable to birth your baby? Because if they don't, there might be more advocacy required,
Yeah,
for
absolutely.
sure.
I actually wrote about a little bit about that in my book, about the fact that preconceptions of the practitioner, I think it was the words that I used regarding Dr. Sarah Wickham's work, about the fact that plus size women are automatically more likely to end up with a cesarean section because they are acted upon sooner, if you like. I don't know if there's a better way to say that, but effectively it's just that they whip you down for a C-section way before you need one, because chances are you're probably going to end up with one anyway.
Yes.
You know, it's just not true. It's just not true. It's just that that's their belief, and that's what they think. So yeah, I think
And that's what drives me crazy.
yeah,
That's what drives me crazy, is
absolutely. And
because
that's why I think it's so important for birth partners to know and understand that, because they can then say, wait a minute, you're making these moves unnecessarily. We're absolutely fine. Things are going well. Please step back and leave us to it, because we know that this is something that you do to a lot of people, but we're not going to stand up. We're not going to stand for that. So, I think that's important. I think what was interesting there was about the monitoring, which you said, which I hadn't appreciated. So are you suggesting that what they might offer is a fetal scalp monitor rather than the belt monitor, purely because they can get a more consistent trace on the baby?
yes,
So
yes,
women again are
yes.
shamed into having this kind of monitoring purely because it's easier for them to have a, is that, what would you say? Or would you say actually it's a wise move to go for that kind of monitoring? What's your view on that?
My view is always to do whatever you're most comfortable with. But I do believe that the reality is that if you choose continuous fetal monitoring, it is more challenging. There is more fat tissue on a plus size person's abdomen, and sometimes those belts, the getting the CTG, may have to be pushed considerably into a larger person's abdomen. And I've had people come to me after the fact who've been bruised. The monitor has just been shoved so hard into their abdomen throughout their labor that they have they leave with bruises all over their abdomen. Whereas if they had chose intermittent fetal monitoring, or the internal, where it is in baby's scalp, that might have been a choice that they wanted to make. But sometimes it's just chosen for convenience. If we want to get a consistent read, we do, they will suggest the internal. I've also seen it as a form of negotiation, which also really drives me crazy, where someone is using the belts and they're trying to get, that good read for 20 or 30 minutes, whatever the case may be. And the mom is happy enough to do that, whether that's on a ball, in bed, or, whatever movements she's making. However, if she wants to get into the shower or she wants to move somewhere else, it's almost an act of negotiation of, well, if you allow us to do the internal fetal monitoring, you'll be able to move much more than you are now, and you'll just be much more comfortable. So even if somebody doesn't want do you know what I mean? Even if somebody doesn't want the internal fetal monitoring, it's like, well, if you consent to this, then we'll quote unquote allow you to do this other thing.
Mm.
And I just, it, it's an icky kind of feeling where you can just see how somebody being promoted to do something they may not really want to do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you always have the opportunity to say, wait, hold on a second, I don't want to do the continuous or the internal. Or let's go back to just doing the intermittent fetal monitoring, where I can move and be active and I don't have to compromise on any of these things that I actually really want, especially if baby and you are doing well and there's no reason for concern. So I hear stories of that happening too.
So, just to clarify, then, what you're saying is there is no real reason to put a belt monitor on any woman anyway, unless there's, some kind of like high medical need, in which case, leave them alone. Listen to the baby intermittently, just like you would with anybody, and, step away from, from that, because I think that if a plus size woman is thinking, oh well, I have to be monitored more closely, that's not true actually.
That's not true.
Yeah,
That's not true whatsoever.
yeah,
There is no time when everybody needs continuous fetal monitoring, no matter what your size. No matter what your size, it is still a choice. It is still
yeah.
absolutely a choice. So yes, unless there's a reason for it, of course, which can happen again with anybody in any size. But if everything's well with you and baby, you absolutely can choose the intermittent if that's what you want.
Perfect, thank you. I really want to move on to talk about you a little bit more, but I have one more thing that's niggling in the back of my head, and that is water birth. How many plus size women and pregnant people are allowed into water?
I would say that really depends on where you're located and where you're giving birth. So unfortunately, there's in Ireland, for example, there can be some BMI limits, which I could talk about for 5 hours. How disgruntled I am, from for this reason. So many people in Ireland have been told if they have a higher BMI that they are not allowed into the pool in the hospital. And this isn't even to give birth in. This could just be for labor.
Right.
And oftentimes the reason that they're given is because of your BMI, aka because of your weight. If something were to happen to you and or baby, staff will not be able to lift you out of the tub.
Yeah.
This is the reason they're given. And can I swear? To be honest, I think it is a complete and utter bullshit reason, because it would be challenging to get anybody out of that pool, regardless of their size. If somebody is in water and you're having to lift somebody's full body weight out, no matter what size they are, that would be a challenge. Second of all, you can drain the pool. If something is happening with a plus size mom and her baby, you can drain the pool and you can get access to that person still within the pool. And lastly, pregnant people, no matter what their size, are still entitled to autonomy and informed choice.
Yeah.
So if I am a fat person and I am told exactly what I just said, if there's an issue between with you or baby and we can't get you out of the pool, that's a problem.
Yeah.
I would honestly say the chances of that happening are very low. And to be honest with you, I'm fine with that. That's a choice that I ultimately get to make
Yeah.
as an adult. And if I'm okay with that, or anybody of any size is okay with that, I believe they should be entitled to get into that pool because there's so many benefits to
Absolutely.
using water throughout labor. So again, we're looking at what are the potential benefits, what are the potential risks. And if I say I'm okay with that risk, who who is somebody else to say, well, I'm not? So I just think we need to completely frame how choices are presented to people. And I find it amazing that a plus size person can give birth in water within their own home in the exact same location is the hospital where they're being told, no, you can't. It's a complete disconnect. I don't think people of size should be so grossly limited in options.
Completely agree. Completely. And that brings us nicely onto your story. So I had the privilege of listening to you being interviewed by the lovely birth activists on their podcast. And you had your fifth baby and you talked about your story, which I highly recommend everybody goes over to the birth activist podcast and has a listen to your birth story, which was in 2020. When did you give birth?
I had Iris in July.
July. And what was so amazing about your story, you had your second home birth, I think. What was so amazing was how quiet Becky and Sam were when they were listening to you talk about your story, because they are, they were just sort of sat there in complete silence, listening in awe of how your story went and how you really tuned into your instincts and how lovely the birth was, even though you had a couple of interesting scenarios that happened during that birth that were fascinating. And I want the listeners to go over and listen to that themselves, so I don't want to give them any spoilers. But what I also noticed about your birth story was that as you were pregnant in that fifth pregnancy, you felt quite vulnerable. You had moments where you were quite scared and you needed reassurance. And I think it's very important for any birth partner listening to know that just because you are having your fifth baby, that doesn't mean you're an expert in giving birth. You still are a pregnant person with a high level of need to be reassured and to have people surround you who give you strength and positivity. You can't be solely responsible for everything that's on your shoulders. You need to have the right support around you. So I just wondered if you could share a little bit about that, and how you did feel and what you do think birth partners would benefit from hearing around women who are pregnant for the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth times.
Yeah, so I originally, so this was, yeah, fifth pregnancy. I was planning my third home birth and it was on my birthday. That's the only reason I can remember, was because I woke up at 5 a.m. on my birthday into my second trimester and I was just overwhelmed with fear. And this was coming from a person who, again, was pregnant for the fifth time, but I was also a trained doula. Like, I knew so much about birth, even more than your average person. And I woke up with this fear, and initially, I didn't want to confront it. I didn't want to even address it because the first thing I thought was a judgment, of how you are a birth doula. You support other people giving birth. How can you possibly be afraid? And it was that judgment, and I could still feel it now. It was that judgment of like, how can you be afraid? And the reality is that birthing people are strong people, but they're strong people during a very vulnerable time.
Yeah.
And whether you're giving birth for the first time, second, third, as you said, it is still a vulnerable time. And my biggest concern, which has always, during each of my pregnancies, the fear of the unknown is always what would kind of feel the biggest for me. Of, there's so much we can control in our lives. Birth is not one of those things that you can control, and that drives me a little crazy sometimes. And I was like, okay, well, I can do everything I can, all the different types of preparation to make this a really positive experience, and find that size friendly provider, which I did, prepare my partner, which I did. But there's still that fear of the unknown, and also wanting to make sure that the people who were going to support me knew how to support me. So, for example, during my fourth pregnancy, I had a midwife at my birth. However, that midwife had moved to the UK. So now I had a new person supporting me. And it was an opportunity to build a new relationship with her. And basically, I was priming her for, these are how my last births went. And I remember telling her, like, I just want you to know I don't always like to be touched. And I don't ever want you commenting on if I'm making noise. I wanted to be able to freely vocalize without anybody mentioning it. And there's a whole backstory to that. But I got to know my midwife and filled her in. And my husband had been a really amazing birth partner. And I wanted to ensure that he was going to continue being an amazing birth partner this fifth time. So it wasn't as if I just assumed he knew everything. Like, oh, he's done this before too, so he knows what to do. That's not how I approached it, and I wouldn't advise anybody to approach it that way either. Like, there were multiple evenings where we were, sitting across from each other in the sitting room, and I remember the night when I told him, I was like, I have these fears and I just need to tell you about them. I have this fear that I'm going to go into labor and it's going to be the most intense, painful experience of my life. I came right out and I told him that. And my biggest thing was that I kept doubting that I wasn't going to be able to tolerate or cope with it. Because again, how often are people told, especially like women in general, people of size, how often are we told, like, oh, you're not going to be able, you're not strong enough, you're not going to be able to deal with it, this is going to be bigger than you. And it was picking that apart, and that's essentially what I spent my pregnancy doing, was having those conversations with myself and also with my partner, and just telling him, like, you remember, my son's name is Graham, and I said, you remember during Graham's labor how you had, like, you were giving me the snacks and you had the food there and you were rubbing my back and all those lovely things that you were doing, like, don't forget to do that this time. Don't forget how important that is for me. And if I'm struggling, these are some things I think would be helpful. And this time I had trained in hypnobirthing, so I was also very much like, do not let those tracks stop. Like, if the track ends, I need you to have another one. And he ordered headphones, like noise canceling headphones for me, So I was very much like, it was to the point where I even made a list. I was like, here's everything in the little home birth kit. And we went through it together. So here's the towel I want you to use for baby. Here's clean underwear. It was some of the practical stuff as well.
And that's so important, and really important for me to want to get across to anyone listening to this, because there's two sides of this. There's the birth partner who needs to make sure that they are aware of it, but there's also the pregnant person who needs to sit back and acknowledge that without telling them that, how the hell are they going to know? Because they're not mind readers. They haven't maybe been to more than one or two, or in your partner's case, he's been to more than that, but it was important for you to recap, revisit, and talk about what it is that you needed them to do to support you. And I think that we need to remember that, because there can be a tendency to reflect back afterwards and say, well, why didn't you help me, why didn't you do this in a certain scenario? Well, if they don't know that's what they're meant to do, they're not going to be able to. So well done you for making sure that you know, had that time together, that you sat down and you went through exactly what you really needed him to remember and to do for you. Because I think that means then you can relax on the day and know that they have got your back, that they have, you know, the information that they need and where things are in the birth bag and how to, you know, give you the particular things that you've said you needed. So yeah, it's really good
Yeah.
that you did that.
Yeah, it put my mind at ease of like and at the end of pregnancy there's so much preparation going on, not only for the birth but for after postpartum as well. And it was just having those conversations was one more thing that I could tick off my list, and I could say he knows exactly what to do. And when we had those conversations, and I gave him the practical things as well. So some of it was the emotional stuff. Some of it was like, this is how you can take care of me emotionally. But here's all these other practical things I need you to do, because I'm not going to be in the frame of mind to have to remind you to do these things. Like, I just want to focus on what my body is doing, and I need you to basically take care of everything else. And the peace of mind and the relief that that gives people at the end of pregnancy and in labor is worth its weight in gold, because it's
Absolutely.
just, it reduces stress, and you're just able to let go knowing that you're safe and taken care of.
Yeah.
And no matter what number baby it is, you deserve that peace of mind for sure.
Yeah. And I think that's what a doula brings too. You know, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, my partner would never manage any of that, then you need to bring someone into your team that's going to support both them and you, because that's, you know, one of the benefits of having a doula is somebody who, the minute that they walk in the door, your shoulders drop and you think, ah, they're here, they've got it, they know, they've you know, done all of this work pre labor, and they fully understand what my needs and benefits are. I know in your example you had a private midwife, which you know, kind of to many extent replaces the need for a doula for some people, not all, but I think that, you know, most of us want as few people at our birth as possible, so having, you know, masses of people isn't going to work. But you effectively had the same relationship where you would have been able to explain to them, as you said before, actually, that you knew that they knew what you needed from them, which is great. I need to ask you my last question, which
Sure.
is, what do you think every birth partner should know? What is your top tip?
My top tip is, when in doubt, follow the birthing person's lead.
Perfect.
So if you don't know what to do and you're sat there wondering if you should do anything, sometimes the best thing you can do is nothing and just let them get on with it. And I've, listened to your podcast and listened to other podcasts as well. I was fine doing what I was doing. And it actually would have been more annoying if my husband or midwife or doula had been saying, do you want to try this? Do you want to try this? Do you want to try this? I truly believe that if people are left to their own devices, in most cases, if they know, what position, they will instinctively get into a position that works for them. They will reach for water or reach for something to eat when they need it. Occasionally some prompts are needed. Have you used the toilet lately? Little things like that. But I do truly believe that in many cases, when in doubt, if you're following their lead, that can, solve many questions about what should I be doing. Sometimes you don't need to be doing anything other than just being there and reassuring them with just your hand on their hand or seated next to them. So
Absolutely. That's the being, not doing, isn't it? It's wonderful. But also recognizing that she's working with her instincts, and instincts mean everything.
yes, yes, let the hormones and the instincts lead the way.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
I
thank you.
I'd like you to tell everybody where they can find you.
Very easy. So if you type in fat and pregnant into Google or fatandpregnant.com or fat and pregnant on Instagram, you will see me there. I had loads of bits and pieces from my own pregnancies, and I'm throwing out all kinds of hints and tips for advocating for yourself, finding a size friendly provider. What does it mean when somebody says maintain your weight during pregnancy? Because there's so much to plus size pregnancy that we just don't openly talk about. So yeah, loads of different things there.
And what about when your book is going to be published?
Yeah, so I'm accepting birth stories until the 28th of February, and then my book will be printed in the summer. So that's going to contain a part one is going to be more of the informative side, which covers some of the things we talked about today and, what is the positive birth, how to prepare for that. But then the second half is going to be all different types of birth stories. I'm actually really excited, really excited about it because there's all different types of birth, and really, positive birth can come in many different forms. And it's very exciting now because all the pictures are coming in of the mums and babies, which is just excellent to be able to pair with the story. So yeah, I'm excited about that. And it's just another way, for people to connect, with the size of positive plus size pregnancy, and something they can take with them and refer to regularly.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so pleased that you've, got that coming out and that it can support other people to see what's normal and what they can achieve. So thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I'll catch up with you again in the future.
Sounds perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.